Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to 198 CPR CSH Urban Workshop. And today we have Preeti Sampat with us. Based on her long-term anthropological research in Gujarat and Goa, her talk titled Urbanization and Land Rent, A Genealogy of Property, Caste and Capital in India, will offer insights into rent as a conceptual category. Before she begins, I'll introduce her briefly. Preeti Sampat is Associate Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Krea University in India. Her research interest includes overlapping themes around land, infrastructure, and urbanization, capital value and economic growth, labor, caste and rent, and state sovereignty and social movements. She has contributed several chapters, book chapters, research papers, civil society reports, and media articles along these themes. Her forthcoming co edited volume, titled Land, Relational Practice for Contemporary Politics by University Press of Colorado, examines land and its affordance relationally. It brings together anthropologists and geographers studying land relations in diverse, historically mediated socio-material contexts across the globe. A recent article titled The Rentier Economy of Growth Infrastructure Value Appropriation Without Adequate Accumulation in India examines the value relation of land rent and growth infrastructure in India. Preeti has curated the Living Histories of Land in Goa Mobile Museum with support from the Wengren Foundation Engaged Anthropology Grant. She is currently finalizing her monograph examining social relations around land rent, infrastructure, urban development, economic growth, law, and resistance in India. So, Preeti, you have 40 to 45 minutes to complete your talk, which will be followed by Q&A from our participants. And to all those who are present online, I request you to kindly type your questions in the chat box. We will read out to Preeti, and you can also raise your hands and ask your questions directly to Preeti. So over to you, Preeti. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rama, and thank you, CPR and CSH, for organizing this workshop. I'm really excited about the opportunity to present my work with all of you, and I'm hoping that, everybody will participate in the discussion and maybe we can take away a little, everybody can contribute and take away a little from our discussions today. So just to give you a little bit of, maybe I can start actually sharing my screen. Is it visible? Yeah. So just to give you a kind of an overview of the talk, I was thinking that I had a little word with Champaka, and I thought maybe let's look at a little historically at the property relation and how it is completely entwined with caste in the subcontinent to understand what we think of as land rent, because ultimately land can give you rent only if you're a property owner, right? And here, of course, we're not talking about rent as only kiraya that a tenant pays to the landlord, say for a property that they're renting out or for land that they're renting out, but it's also the land price. So it's also the land price that is available for sale, that land is available for sale at. So when we're talking about land rent as a conceptual category, it's not just kiraya, but it's also the sale price, right? And in that sense, I mean, I can't ask for a sale price if I don't own a property. And that's why property ownership really becomes really key to understanding this phenomenon of land rent, or what has also been called speculation, that is occurring in various parts of the country at very, very high rates and intensifying all the time. So to give you a context of this photograph that you're seeing, this is from one of my field sites in the Dholera Smart City. It's right at the center, at the heart of the Dholera Smart City activation zone. And I'll talk about Dholera a little bit further along. But as you can see, there's this kind of huge hoarding, which you can see in many infrastructure projects, around the country these days, which is promising luxurious projects, including residential and commercial plots in Dholera. This photo was taken in 2021, and I also had the opportunity to visit the field site earlier this year in 2026. As you can see, the horizon behind it is fairly clear, and in the last 5 years, there's not that much more development that has taken place. Perhaps the hoardings would have changed because different kinds of developers have come in and gone, and I don't know how that actually materializes in terms of in 2015 when I went, there were other developers that were promising luxurious commercial and residential plots. In 2026, there were yet other sort of developers that were promising these plots. But the horizon is more or less the same. There isn't really very much development. And so, in a sense, I have been trying to unpack what is really happening, because certainly the land prices have really gone up from the time of 2015 when I had actually first visited the area to now. And this is something that we see all across wherever there are urban infrastructure projects coming up, or along urbanizing peripheries. I don't know how it is in small towns, and perhaps people present here who have more experience in those regions will be able to tell us a little more. But so this form of sort of anticipation of the city that is to come, of the development that is to come, right, is something that we are seeing all across these project sites. And I thought, let's actually look at this question of property a little more historically and contextualize it before we begin to unpack what is really happening in these sites. And I mean, when you think about the modern property form, as we that we actually have as part of our social, political, legal frameworks, the modern property form in the Indian subcontinent in particular, and of course in many parts of the ex-colonies of England, follow the English liberal tradition, right? Or genealogically emerge from the English liberal tradition. So if you think about the English liberal tradition, of course, Hobbes and Locke, and there are several other folks, Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf, and all of these theorists from the 17th century who are theorizing what it means to have a society based on natural rights, right? And this is also a time of ferment, and they are trying to figure out who is the sovereign, what is the power of sovereignty. Is it a monarch that is a sovereign? Is it a social contract? What constitutes a social contract? And Locke is particularly interesting in this tradition because he argues that property emerges when a person mixes their labor with the land. And of course, we're talking 17th century when, most parts of the world are, or the social world, human social world is agrarian. So, in that sense, this idea that the origin of property emerges from mixing one's labor with the land, right? And so, if I've mixed my labor with the land, I have legitimate claim to the fruits of the land simply because I have mixed my labor, right? And this is my natural right. It's my natural right because I don't require any monarch or any other authority to give this to me. It is as natural to me as the right to life and the right to liberty, right? So for Locke, it's the right to life, liberty, and property, right? Which are the sort of underpinnings of society. Life, liberty, and property that must be defended against any kind of despotic monarch as well. So it's not the sovereign, but it is my natural right that comes to me by the sheer sort of fact of my birth that emerges as this kind of capacity to own property. And of course, Locke is famous for having said in the beginning, because he's theorizing what happened, how come everybody doesn't have the right to property. So he's famous for having said in the beginning all the world was America, right? And of course, with all the racism and all the genocide and all the various things that went on in the settling of the Americas, set aside. But in the beginning, all the world was America. And as population, human population increased, what you find is that the capacity of sort of settling on the land started to reduce, and so complex systems began to emerge where different people could enjoy the produce of the land even if they did not really have land. But it was premised on the idea of having access to property. So different forms of property started emerging, right? And this also, in a sense, gives rise to the theory of the social contract, because then the social contract between these property owning individuals is basically to set up a state, a sovereign that is going to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Right. So, in a sense, the state or the sovereign emerges through that social contract. And of course, the sovereign is the arbitrator of any kind of conflicts over property. And what is also interesting is that not only are all these propertied individuals sort of have, not only do they have this natural right to property, but they also have a duty, in a sense, a kind of a moral injunction to profit from that property. So it's not just that you are surviving off that property, but you're also using that property to actually profit from it. And that is really what true society is supposed to promise to you. And the sovereign is supposed to protect your right to life, liberty, and property, right? And as a corollary to that, you then have the sovereign also acting on behalf of the greater common good, which is where the doctrine of eminent domain comes up. Of course, this is more with Hugo Grotius and Pufendorf, who are also theorists of the 17th century. And in a sense, this idea that the sovereign state will act on behalf of the greater common good and will be allowed to take over an individual's property for that greater common good, right? So that idea of eminent domain also emerges through the liberal social contract of the right to life, liberty, and property. And because the right to property is a recognized natural right, the individuals who are dispossessed of their land have the right to claim compensation from the state or the sovereign who is actually taking away their land, right? So all of this kind of emerges in that period of ferment over liberalism and the instituting. Of course, Locke was also famously involved in ensuring a parliamentary sort of monarchy and making sure that the landed gentry was also represented in the British Parliament after the Glorious Revolution and the institution of, I think, King William. I'm sorry, I need to check on that. But one of those folks who were instituted as the sovereign in the parliamentary style monarchy that emerges in England at that time in the 17th century, right? So this is kind of genealogy of the ideology of the property relation. And what I had in the photograph, what I wanted to mention was that this photograph is from a special economic zone in Goa. And what you see on the other side of the fence is the land that was acquired for a particular special economic zone, the sort of Meditab special economic zone that was supposed to come up on a plateau that was already under dispute for a DuPont factory earlier that people had resisted. And the fence as this kind of a social relation that sort of enforces the property relation, right? And so in a sense, just a little bit of aestheticizing, but I also wanted to bring in that shadow in between because it is a social relation. And to borrow from Marx, all that is solid melts into the air. So a social relation can be transformed, and it can be something that can just as well be thought of as something else and not as this hard parcel of private property or economic growth or so on and so forth. But we'll get to that. When we think then about landed property in India, um, which is not to say the forms of property ownership did not exist prior to the colonial rule. And of course, there are forms of escheating, forms of succession, rights of succession, usufruct rights, all kinds of different complex arrangements under various kingdoms and empires that existed in the subcontinent. But the modern property form, as it arrives through the British colonial sort of regimentation or regime of landed property emerges through the permanent settlement of Bengal, which takes place in 1893. And of course, Ranjit Guha is the foremost is the stellar account of how the permanent settlement comes to be. And for those of you who haven't looked at it, I would highly recommend looking at the history of the property relationship in the subcontinent. Of course, prior to the permanent settlement in 1793, I'm sorry, in 1793, you also have a whole ferment of ideas that are an experimentation of how to make sure that land, and at this time, this is Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, because that's the first sort of Diwani that the British acquire, right? So Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, how to make sure that land from these lands, from this principality, is actually able to generate more and more revenue. Because remember, the colonial state is interested in higher revenues, not only to maintain the colonial state, but also to repatriate revenues as well as materials required for the metropolitan markets, for the metropolitan sort of residents who are serving their time in the colony, and so on and so forth. So revenue is an extremely important preoccupation of the colonial state. And they are sort of experimenting with things like the farming system, which was the sort of idea of Warren Hastings, or at least he's credited with it, where lands were auctioned every 4 or 5 years. But that led to a whole lot of corruption and outbidding and inability to pay the kind of revenue that was bidded in the first place, and all kinds of instability. And so the question that, why don't we actually settle the right to property permanently? Right, that question becomes really paramount, and the figure of Philip Francis, of somebody who comes in to serve in the colonial government and is very much influenced by the physiocrats and the utilitarians, is really promoting this idea of the permanent settlement, because according to him, that will enable certainty in the minds of the landlords of their tenure to the land, and it will enable them by also fixing the revenue that the colonial government charges to the landlord. It will also enable in the landlord the certainty that this land belongs to them, unlike the auctioning that was experimented with earlier, and that they have a fixed revenue to pay. And they don't have, the revenue is not arbitrary. And of course, there's all this idea of, this being a land that was, these being lands that were run by arbitrary despots without any systems, which basically depended on the whims of the emperor and so on and so forth, which historians have challenged and shown to be quite a motivated interpretation of the political legal systems prior to colonial rule, right? But so the idea being that we need to institute permanent rights in property so that the landlords would be enabled to actually invest in the land and to augment the revenue coming from the land. And this is also the time of commercialization of agriculture, the sort of integration of agricultural production with the needs of the metropole in terms of the kinds of materials that should be produced, that would be profitable, and so on and so forth. And as Ranjit Guha brilliantly shows, that this is not only about settling property in land and revenue, but it is also about settling the question of sovereignty, because it is the sovereign that enables the right to property and to protect it, right? And the sovereign is then given revenue in return. And of course, the introduction of capitalist agriculture, which is geared towards the market, which is geared towards commercialization, which is geared towards also the metropolitan needs. So you have the emergence of the first of the forms of the permanent settlement, the zamindari. Of course, the historical evidence then shows that it doesn't lead to this kind of development of this class of gentlemen farmers, as in the English countryside, who are making improvements and, creating better irrigation and so on and so forth. What in fact it leads to is this kind of extreme exploitation of tenants and agricultural workers, where the landlords appropriate all the surpluses and, with the fixing of the revenue, they are able to actually keep those revenues, right? And so extreme poverty, extreme sort of appropriation of all the surpluses is what it leads to. Then further revisions take place, and then you have the Mahalwari system and Monroe's Ryotwari system. But again, the thing to remember here, that the figures that are arrived at, the people, the communities that are arrived at by the colonial government are sort of caste communities that they patronize. So if it's zamindars, in the first instance, with the Mahalwaris and the Ryotwaris, it's the middle and other sort of lower peasant classes, right? So it's not the landless Dalit worker, it is not the it's not the Adivasis, it is the middle and other intermediary dominant caste communities that find recognition as the sort of ideal property owning candidate. So when you think about the history of the settlement of property rights and property tenures, it is inseparable from the history of caste and caste domination within the subcontinent, because it is a caste mediated permanent settlement based on the particular communities that the British sort of patronize, right? So this includes Patels, Jats, the Kammas and the Reddys, and so on and so forth. What you then also have at the same time is the question of eminent domain and land acquisition. So, of course, it goes far back into the colonial infrastructures that are being laid out, urban expansion that is taking place at the time, the forms of sort of acquisition of land for, say, irrigation infrastructures, roadways, telegraphs, and urban expansion, which then we retain into the post-independence period, right? So we not only retain this kind of settlement of property, legal settlement of property in the post-independence period, we not only retain this kind of liberal idea of the right to property in the post-independence period, but we also retain the state or the sovereign's power of eminent domain in the post-independence period. So what you then have is the constitutional recognition of the fundamental right to property, which becomes really interesting in the context of land reforms, where the idea, a kind of a socialist idea of trying to redistribute property to sort of break the sort of large landholding communities, or not communities, but to break the large land holdings like the zamindars, and to impose land ceilings and to redistribute that land to the tiller, the actual tiller, to strengthen tenancy rights, the various pillars of the land reform sort of legislation that comes in. But the important thing to remember here again is that land reforms also enshrined the right to property, right? It was about actually making sure that private property was instituted through this kind of a redistribution program. And of course, land reforms, as far as the ceilings and zamindari abolition are concerned, meet with a lot of resistance. When landlords go to the Supreme Court or to the courts, their fundamental right to property and their right to equality before the law is upheld, and they successfully challenge the state's power of eminent domain to actually acquire their land, right? And in that sense, there's a lot of political resistance, and there's a long history of how, of course, then all those land reform laws are subsequently put under the ninth schedule of the Constitution. The right to property is read down from fundamental rights, except for the right to claim compensation when property has been acquired through due legal process, right? So all of this history also comes down with the kind of colonial legacy into the post independence period. It also sort of informs the experience of the land reforms, and there's a lot written about this by various scholars. Ultimately, what does end up happening is where tenancy rights start getting are the ones that are the most successful. Land to the tiller is very limited, and it's mostly commons already available with the state that are redistributed to the landless. But very often this does not really mean that the landless Adivasis or others are actually provided with any kind of land rights, right? And it's really tenancy rights. And the zamindari abolition is also circumvented by making this an individual property ownership, the recognition of individual property ownership. So family members of a zamindar can each claim the right to separate properties, and so thereby retain the large consolidated property within the family, right? So basically, to cut a long story short, the sort of continuance of the right to property in a caste-mediated way, the strengthening of the power of eminent domain, but at the same time, the weakening of the land reforms, which means that then when land acquisition is carried out for post-colonial development infrastructures, it's typically with the strength of the state, which no longer has to cater to the fundamental right to property, right? Because what can then be done is displace a lot of poor agrarian and Adivasi communities. But of course, when it came to actually challenging the rights of the big landlords, there's too much political opposition. And these are also the communities that are extremely important for winning elections, because they are the ones who bring votes in. So in that sense, the project of land reforms really becomes the sort of unsuccessful, right? But property and private property really continues into the post-colonial period. That brings me to this question of the capacity to command land rent, right? So again, you can only command land rent when you have ownership over property, right? Or you can command a rent only when you have ownership over an asset. In our case, we're talking about land rent. And what is really important about land is that it is a portion of monopolized earth, right? And when you think about land as a free gift of nature, when, in the beginning, all the world was America and everything was a free gift of nature. When you think about land as a free gift of nature, the the sort of free gift of nature is a fundamental affordance for all life on earth, not only human beings, but all life on earth. So it's a kind of a multi-species planetary affordance. So when we are talking about the property relation, it is a monopolization of a piece of earth, right? And in the social sort of relationship of the property relation, it emerges, land rent emerges as a factor of income for this monopolized earth. And here we are talking factor of income. When you think about the larger economy, wages are a factor of income for labor, profits are a factor of income for capital, interest is a factor of income for banks and financiers, and rent is a factor of income for landlords or asset owners or what have you in today's times. So when you sort of take this a little bit further and you think about how value is produced, and here I'm also channeling the labor theory of value, and we can have a discussion about that. But when you think about how value is sort of created, value is created in production, right? It's created in production when labor actually mixes with nature or with land in order to produce something, right? And in the sense, the production of value takes place in that moment of production, right? It is then exchanged. Value is then exchanged in various forms as goods, as services, as capital, as finances, as all kinds of forms. It is exchanged in the social relationships of exchange. It is then distributed as a factor of income, and it is then consumed once it is distributed, either through wages or through profits or through rent or through. And of course, when it is distributed and consumed, there can also still be a surplus which can be reinvested, which keeps the circuit of value going, right? So it keeps value circuits growing by making sure that there is reinvestment of the surpluses into creating further surpluses. So we can unpack this in the Q&A if we need to. But basically, if you think about the question of land rent, it then emerges as a factor of income in the moment of distribution of value, not in the moment of production, because rent is not producing, rent is not emerging out of the production of something. It is emerging because you have provided for the land, right? So in a sense, rent as a category, as a factor of income, emerges in the moment of distribution of value. Potentially, then this can lead to a kind of a value contradiction where if the distribution of that value is much higher or is at a scale that is much greater than the production of that value. And just bear with me, and I'll try and sort of explain this through Dolera and what I have been studying in terms of, sectors such as manufacturing and services and speculation and so on and so forth. But there can potentially then be a contradiction where the production of value is at a certain level of value, right? Whereas the distribution of value is already speculating on the future streams of income and the future streams of production, which will happen through labor of all kinds, intellectual, artistic, technical, blue collar, all of that, right? All of that is labor. All of that is what produces value. So in a sense, that moment of distribution can become extremely can grow precisely because of this process of speculation on the future sources of income emerging from future forms of labor or production of value, right? And so in a sense, there is a speculation on what that future is going to return to you as income, right? And there can be a potential contradiction when that future sort of claim is not met. So when you see things like ghost towns, abandoned infrastructures, right? When you see, infrastructures that are failing, right? That future source of income has not been realized, right? So particularly in the case of infrastructures, you need to have further investment coming in to realize the potential value of that infrastructure. If I build a highway and it's not going to be used by anybody and nobody is going to pay toll on that highway, I'm not going to realize the value of that highway, right? It's actually going to be infrastructure that starts getting ruined or that starts getting sort of destroyed because it's just not able to realize its value. Its value is something, the value of infrastructure unfolds over time, right? So, in that sense, there is a potential for a contradiction between the production of value and the distribution of value through the process of speculation. And that speculation emerges in sort of speculation on future sources of income and future sources of labor. And this is what I kind of try and build. And there's a paper that I have out in case people are interested in taking this argument a little bit further or looking at it. You can take a look at this. But to tell you as concisely as possible, the idea that this rentier economy or this economy of rents is growing along these infrastructures that are particularly emerging, what I call growth infrastructures that are particularly emerging in the post-liberalization period, right? And but the liberalization marker is important because prior to liberalization, you also had infrastructural investments, whereas those infrastructural investments were also about making sure that there was capitalist development in the country. The fact is that they were state-led infrastructures. There could be all kinds of, generalized benefits associated with irrigation infrastructures as well, for instance, because this was about generally benefiting all kinds of land holdings, all kinds of landowners, and so on and so forth, right? But with the post-liberalization period, and particularly from the 2000s, what you've really had is the emergence of the discourse of growth. And all infrastructures are consistently about promising that growth, right? What has also taken place post-liberalization is an actual growth in the economy, right? And whereas India was earlier part of the developing economies, we now are supposed to be part of the emerging economies, right? So the transition from developing economy to an emerging economy has also seen a transition in the discourse from development to growth, right? So we no longer hear of development, we hear only of growth. And what is also distinguished about these growth infrastructures that they are invariably in partnership with capital, right? Whereas state-led development infrastructures were typically led by the state, instituted by the state, implemented by the state for a larger public purpose. The idea is that growth itself has now become a larger public purpose, and it is to be instituted in partnership with capital. Very often, the subsidized land and other kinds of resources are provided to capital, and then capital is expected to build, operate, and profit from those infrastructures. You at the same time, whereas we have moved, I would argue, to this time of growth infrastructures and economic growth as being the defining principle of how we understand the Indian economy, at least in policy, you still have a continuation of the eminent domain framework, right? So land acquisition, also land pooling, which was also a colonial kind of introduction through the town and country planning laws, town planning laws. The Bombay Town Planning Act, for instance, in 1915, also had provisions for land pooling. However, the kind of land pooling there was, the land acquired was far less compared to the kinds of land pooling that we are seeing. In Dholera, for instance, 50% of land pooling or land is to be acquired and 50% is to be returned to the peasants as developed plots. Champaka was telling me that it's 75% of land acquired in Amravati and 25% returned to the farmers, right? So to come back to the point I was making, that you have this kind of a transition to growth infrastructures in the post-liberalization period, in partnership with capital, where it is expected that capital will obviously profit from the infrastructure provisioning, developing of those infrastructures. But at the same time, you have the continuation of eminent domain through land acquisition. Land pooling has a very coercive element as well, as we have seen in all accounts where land pooling has been instituted. Ultimately, the voluntaristic nature is compromised in favor of actual forcible acquisition of land, which is what happens in Dholera as well, where initially it was supposed to be this voluntaristic model. Farmers refused to give up their land, and they took the state to court for challenging the Dholera Smart City project. So in that sense, the voluntaristic nature could never ever really be realized, which is different, I think, in Amravati's case, or in Magarpatta's case. But here, what we have is the imposition of land acquisition, right? And what we find is that the land rent enters into a different kind of a dynamic with the announcement of a growth infrastructure. So the minute you have, or the day that you have the announcement that a particular infrastructure project is going to come in, you immediately start seeing speculative activity, which increases the kind of land valuation in the region, and in the region which is directly impacted by that infrastructure project, and in the region surrounding that project, right? So when you think about the moments of rent spiral, which is not to say that these moments are like temporally distinct. They are constantly overlapping, because land acquisition and the sort of consolidation of land is something that takes place over a long period of time, over many, many years, right? So many of these are overlapping. But if you heuristically sort of distinguish these moments, the first kind of spiral occurs when an infrastructure project is announced. And this leads to a kind of speculative activity in anticipation of that future city that is to come, that future industrialization that is to come, that future source of income and labor that is to come. The speculation begins, right, with the announcement. The second moment, and I'm sure others, and I hope others can come up with more, maybe from their field areas. The second moment arrives at the time of allotment of land after it has been consolidated to particular developers and financiers who are actually taking care of the development of that particular infrastructure. So that moment of allotment, when the state has consolidated that land, already speculation has been rife, but at the same time, the compensation that is provided to people is at the land rates prevailing at the day of announcement of the infrastructure. So looking at 3 years prior to the date of announcement, and coming up with an average sort of price of land, and compensation is given at that prevailing official land rate of the time that the project is announced. But in the meanwhile, post-announcement, speculation has run rife, land price has really grown. And then by the time for consolidation and allotment arrives, there's another round of speculation where the state enters into the rentier relationship by commanding rent for the land that it has allotted. So what you typically find, for instance, in Dholera, if you had land that was acquired or supposed to be acquired at the rate of, say, 40 rupees per square meter, or 200 rupees per square meter, depending on the quality of land and irrigation and so on and so forth, in 2011, by the time that land allotments are being made in 2015, 2017, the price of land that the state is sort of the price that the state is commanding has grown several hundred times, right? So you actually have the state trying to lease out land for some 6,000 rupees per square meter. By the time you come to around 2026, you already have the land allotments at some 20,000 and more rupees per square meter, right? So you actually see a spiral of allotment that is taking place as well at the moment of allotment, where land rent goes through another increment. And then the final increment also, and not the final as in the terminal, but a kind of another moment that arrives is when the infrastructure is finished and handed out to the actual consumers, right? So, for instance, I'm sitting in Sri City right now. That infrastructure has been handed out to, say, Krea University and to several other kind of industries that have come up, and other social infrastructures and operators that have come up in Sri City. And that is at a much higher level than the moment of allotment, because by now development has taken place, infrastructure has been sunk into the land, and the price that the land commands it is at a much higher level, and the anticipation of future returns to that land or that property are also much higher, right? So heuristically speaking, these are moments that we can distinguish where spirals of speculation take place. Now, again, what happens if that development never really arrives, or is so delayed that it kind of really I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to say. It's like literally waiting for Godot. So when you think about Dholera, for instance, it was announced in 2009. Over 920 square kilometers, 22 villages, right? And people immediately started organizing into sort of this Bhal Bachao Samiti, Bavisgam sort of Samiti that were challenging the acquisition of their land. They took, there were many protests, sit-ins, dharnas, marches, all kinds of, political action. There was the Mandal Bochraji SIR in the vicinity that also similarly saw similar protests over acquisition of 48 villages, where the protests were actually also successful, right? And that's got to do with contingencies in electoral years and the politics of what the government of the time, which is the current prime minister, was then the chief minister, felt was necessary to be also sort of done to be placating the kind of unrest that they were seeing. So you saw in Dholera this kind of resistance to land acquisition. In 2010, I think it is, that the farmers actually challenged the legitimacy of the Dholera Smart City project itself in the courts. And by 2015, I think I have my genealogy right, but by 2015, the High Court of Gujarat stayed any further land consolidation in Dholera, right? So by 2015, the government had only managed to acquire 21 square kilometers of land. So the photograph that I showed you at the beginning was that 21 square kilometers of land of the activation zone, right? So the project is announced in 2009. And the photograph that I showed you is from 2021. I have visited there in 2026. And to date, there are 5 or 6 projects that have come in, factories that have come in, or plants that have come in, including a solar plant that has come in, solar energy plant that has come in 2026, in that small 21 square kilometer activation zone. Right. So you have all of the speculation that is taking place, where the land prices are growing thousandfold year by year. Right. What also then happens is during the pandemic in Dholera, the government sort of uses emergency powers by allotting on paper land for a highway to the National Highway Authority of India, and the National Highway Authority uses emergency powers. And in 2021, with the presence of police force, starts acquiring land for building an expressway. So to date, you now have that expressway that is running from Ahmedabad to Bhavnagar, which is known as the Dholera Expressway. There is some traffic on the Dholera Expressway, which cuts through the fields between Ahmedabad and Dholera proper, which is the activation zone, which is at the center of that Dholera Smart City region. But there is very little sort of thoroughfare on any kind of points beyond that activation zone up to Bhavnagar, right? And like I said, there are some 5 or 6 industrial units that have come out. Now, the expressway itself also cuts through the agricultural fields. These are also coastal regions, so access to sort of the land open, keeping the land open is very important for the waters to actually flood through and recede from the agricultural land parcels, because the waters periodically come in and the rainwater gets clogged, and they need to actually go through to the sort of shore and go through into the sea. So because these are estuarine coastal zone areas. So the expressway is cutting through the fields and creating islands of water clogging. It's also cutting up parcels, land parcels, with very small sort of canals for thoroughfare, which also get waterlogged. People are not able to really cultivate in the small parcels which are cut across. And of course, what now is the kind of status with the legal case is in 2024, after the expressway land was acquired through emergency powers of eminent domain. People withdrew their case, saying that we will actually negotiate for better compensation in a kind of a resigned effort at coming to some conciliation. And I met some of the older activists. Some of them are paralyzed. Some of them are very old. They are BP patients. It's a completely generational passing out of that story of agriculturalists, where perhaps the younger generation also is no longer looking to agriculture. And because of speculation and land price growth and rentiering that is growing in the region, they are now negotiating for better terms. But of course, the compensation rates remain at 2011 prices. So their biggest grievance, when I went and met people in several villages earlier this year, is to get higher compensation. However, the resistance is kind of, or the organization, the peasant organization is kind of now individualized. It's it's no longer the solidarity does not exist. It's literally almost like everybody to themselves. There isn't a kind of a coming together of people, which you saw earlier. And this is, of course, through time, this is taking place, this kind of fragmentation of solidarities. So in a sense, then, this form of rentiering also, which is the project begins in 2009 until 2026. You have 5 or 6 industries coming in. This is something that gets replicated also at a larger level in the special economic zones, where you actually have the national experience of special economic zones, where the Comptroller and Accountant General of India already criticizes the special economic zones model, saying that 50% of the land, and this is something that comes up in the parliament in 2022 through a parliamentary question as well, that 50% of the land acquired for special economic zones, I think at this point it stands for around 44,000 hectares. No, it couldn't be 44,000. I'll have that figure somewhere. Sorry, I'll check. 44,000 something. Anyway, I'll get back with the figure. But the entire land that is acquired, of which only half the land is actually being used up for special economic zones. The Comptroller and Accountant General points out that the sort of special economic zones do not add significantly to exports from the country. They are actually, they have proved havens for those existing industries that relocated to special economic zones in order to save taxes. Of course, in 2017, the US took the special economic zones model to court challenged it in the WTO, and the WTO upheld the challenge, and as providing sort of benefits that were sort of not acceptable in the World Trade Organization regime, and that were favoring unfairly the Indian Special Economic Zone. So those provisions had to be sort of also removed from the law, or those provisions of subsidies and the kinds of benefits they were getting had to be removed from the law, which has also meant that steadily the interest for special economic zones has gone down. When earlier there were some 700 zones proposed, you're actually having some 420 odd special economic zones left today. So in a sense, all of that expectation and anticipation of development, industrialization, growth, jobs, employment generation, and through that, economic prosperity is not really ticking. It's not really taking off, right? And you have, of course, experts also talking about this K-shaped nature of the Indian economy, where you have the few large capitalists that are, and others, elites who are amassing wealth, whereas you have, particularly, of course, in the post-pandemic period, but also in the longer history of demonetization and all of that has gone down, the kind of whittling away of the kind of income generation of the lower classes of folks in the country. So a kind of a K-shaped Indian economy, right? Which is what then, and when you look at the figures on manufacturing has remained at 15 to 16% of the GDP for the past 30, 40 years since the 1980s. And of course, it's growing because the economy has grown at various percentage points. But at the same time, it's not really taken off the way it was supposed to, with special economic zones, with all of these special investment regions. Dholera is supposed to be a special investment region, and all these other kinds of interventions, big growth infrastructures that were sort of created in order to attract investment and create sort of manufacturing and jobs and so on and so forth, right? But at the same time, land prices continue to keep growing, which is what then leads me to argue that what we are seeing is an appropriation of value without adequate accumulation or production of value.
You have
Yeah.
a few minutes more. You have
Okay.
about 5 minutes more.
Okay, I'm just about to end. Thank you. So, which is what then leads us to this kind of a circuit of precarity, where I'm thinking also about the value circuit, but also about destroying existing sources of income, whether it is agriculture, whether it is, the existing sort of political economy of the regions where these infrastructures are introduced, the sort of materialization or non-realization of all of this sort of infrastructure and investment that is anticipated. But also in terms of the kind of ecologies that this kind of fosters. And here, I mean, of course, this is another project that I've been wanting to work on, where you're also thinking along construction of all of these infrastructures. And if they do materialize, the kinds of demands on construction materials, and what does that mean in terms of the built environments of all of these infrastructures, with their constant demand for stone, sand, bricks, which is the transformation of land and propertied land into these kind of built environments. So your brick comes from, Pratik Mishra's work on agricultural fields, which are being converted. The topsoil is being taken into converting them into bricks. You have the Aravalis, the recent judgment of the court basically trying to legalize illegal quarrying in the Aravalis. I recently visited a kind of a construction stone quarry, and this is like ordinary stone. I'm not even talking about marble and sort of granite or any other fancy stone, but the kind of conversion of these commons into these resources for built environments, the extraction of sand. There's a lot of work now that is trying to document the extraction of sand from riverbeds, from coastal zones, to feed this frenzy of construction, and also the question of labor, because the jobs, and of course, when you talk about the growth of the economy is growing on the service sector, out of which the sort of privileged IT sector produces maybe 1% of the job creation. The large majority of jobs that are being sort of created in the services sector are in the informal and low-end services. And there are figures to this end. You can take a look at them. I've documented some of these figures in my paper as well. But the fact that also the labor that comes with extraction and with construction, and also when these infrastructures are in place, are very precarious forms of labor. So obviously construction and extraction labor have very little security. They have very little, there's this constant sort of hazards with work, very little protections. But even in a place like Sri City, where every family was promised jobs in the city or in the zone, they are being given annual contracts, right? So a member of the family is being given annual contracts, and every year they have to re-enter into these annual contracts. So it's not exactly as if there are any kind of employment sort of stability, conditions of employment stability, but the labor is in a sense also precarious. And finally, just a final point to end with is then how do we think about a different relationship with land? And here again, I'm making a shameless plug for the forthcoming volume, which is basically thinking about land as a fundamental affordance for all life on Earth, and what it would mean then to have a different sort of meaning attached to land than the social relation of property, which we have seen its antecedents and what its implications are, and what it might mean to enter into a relationship with land of kinship, especially when we are talking about climate change. We're talking about transgressing planetary boundaries. Out of the 9 planetary boundaries, land use change is one of the most sort of rapidly changing, rapidly transgressed planetary boundaries. So if you look at the climate change discourse, some 7 of 9 planetary boundaries have been transgressed, and land use change is one of the sort of planetary boundaries that has really really rapidly changed. So in that sense, how can we think about land then, not as a property relation, a caste mediated property relation, but as a relational category of affordances for all, with a wider set of social meanings and perhaps a utopian relationship of kinship? I'll end over there.
Thank you very much, Preeti. That was so engaging. Really, inspires us to deepen our theoretical pursuits. Thank you very much for sharing your, very rich research. I've had conversations with you prior to this workshop. My own work, as I shared earlier as well, is about the entrepreneurial state in India. And what comes to my mind, having listened to your presentation and also having engaged with your work in the past, is about the concept of entrepreneurial rents. And I draw on neo-Schumpeterians actually to study this whole phenomenon. And as you mentioned that through project announcement, allotment of land to capital, and then the phase of development, lease, and sale, where there's a huge, there's quite a substantial amount of uncertainty there, and spirals of speculation which sort of complicate that uncertainty and risk. Central to that is, the post, as you meant, I'm just sort of reiterating what you mentioned, is post-liberalization, and my work also it pertains to infrastructure governance post-liberalization in the era of, privatization and mechanisms of privatization, where infrastructure is integral to speculative growth, which itself becomes synonymous with welfare. And so here I wanted to share some thoughts and also share a question about what Schumpeterian rents would mean in a context, for instance, Dholera, where Schumpeterian rents are earned by innovators here, because the state is also, the entrepreneurial state here is also synonymous with an innovation state. And then you also have policies and reforms which are supportive of innovation. And these are profits made by both states, by businesses, but also surpluses made, anticipative surpluses made by the state, resulting from new processes which are produced through interactions and frictions between misaligned stakeholders. So I was just curious to also hear your thoughts on, a Schumpeterian sort of a perspective on entrepreneurial rents, which are integral to the idea of infrastructure and growth being inseparable from welfare. But that's more sort of an overarching question, which I thought I could share before we take questions from participants as well. There's several questions that have already come in, and we've had more than 135 participants. It's a huge set of participants here, and really grateful to all of them for their interest. We have one question from Kuratul Ain Mariam. Nice to have you here, Kuratul. So she says, have you studied the occum produced by the interaction of socialist property regimes with the growth infrastructure and the following speculation driven by private capital? She also follows it up with another question on how have socialist property regimes themselves metamorphosed? How socialist property regimes themselves have metamorphosed is, yes, so over to you, please. And then we could take questions from the office as well.
Maybe I could take a couple more.
Sure. Mridula Garg says, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Could you share more about the contemporary caste relations among different stakeholders and how they may have transformed in Dholera over the years before and since 2009? Then there's another question by Vikas Giri. Vikas says, how can we become the first producer in fisheries after using our natural resources under the domain of UN clause? Perhaps we could request them to elaborate a little bit on this question. But would you like to respond, Preeti?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, of course, there is a kind of a entrepreneurialism involved in landlords now sort of frontiering, right? And even Thomas Cohen's work is talking about that. Shubhra Gurani's work is also talking about that. Sushmita Pati's work is also talking about this entrepreneurialism, right? And to that extent, of course, they're trying to make good of an opportunity that is sort of made available. But at the same time, my question is with the larger sort of economic growth and development situation. Also, along questions of equity and what does it mean to really think about equitable growth and equitable development, right? And the fact that um, uh, sure they are making good on rentiering in the present moment, but what happens really, and this is something which is an open question, and what happens really when those promises are not really kept, right? How far do you get to rentier from them? I mean, sure, in a place like Gurgaon, it's a different kind of a dynamic altogether. But in the case of a greenfield urban project like Dholera, where it's already the proximity to Ahmedabad and the proximity to Bombay is not really enabling that kind of a shift in investments. Is it then that Dholera is an exceptional case? That doesn't seem to be so, because when you look at the special economic zones data, there again, you had a lot of these proposals made with great enthusiasm. However, they actually failed to attract that kind of capital and that kind of investment. So I'm sure there were entrepreneurial rentiers that emerged in those regions as well. But I'm not sort of sure what happens to them over the longer term, right? Even with Amravati, with a lot of the farmers coming together now in order to become shareholders. And perhaps there are more people who have studied contexts like this, and they can shed some more light. But to me, this is a kind of a contradiction that is something to watch out for, that is speculative and hence also risky. And given the kinds of precarities involved, whether it is the destruction of the existing political economy or ecology, I think this needs to be something that needs more unpacking over time. And it can only be studied over time. It's something that can only unfold over time. As far as socialist property regimes are concerned, I haven't really studied a particular context of socialist property regime, and it would help if you had a particular context in mind. So if I've read any literature, maybe I could sort of think about it. But how then they have morphosed. I don't know. I mean, in terms of China, there seems to be a lot of sort of initiative by the state, right? And China has been able to capitalize on actually opening up to investments, which, by the way, is it's the Chinese model that we are trying to emulate all the time, right? I mean, the whole sort of idea of these growth infrastructures was to kind of emulate the Chinese model and become the second alternative to China as the global factory. But that has not really come our way. And China has been able to secure those kinds of investments and to kind of metamorphose to speculation, and at the same time, speculation that is realizable through future investments that are coming into China. So I think there is a very different case of speculation or manner in which speculation must occur in China, because there's actually economic growth that is taking place, which is leading to the moment of production. They are actually producing value in China. I think it would be great if somebody were to actually unpack this analysis with existing figures from China that are available. Contemporary caste relations in Dholera. I mean, what you do have in Dholera are the big landowning sort of communities are your Koli Patels as well as the Thakurs, right? And the Thakurs, the sort of darbars, they are called darbars here. The darbars are the ones with the big sort of land holdings, whereas the Koli Patels have smaller mid to middle, like 5 to 10 acres, sometimes 2 acres of land, right? And these are the particular communities that got together. Obviously, not the landless Dalits, but these are the communities that got together to also resist the project and then eventually also withdrew the case. So what you do see then is a capacity to actually enjoy rent is also determined by the amount of land that you can lay claim to, right? So if you have a large land parcel, you can actually give away parts of that land, say, along the expressway to an investor, to a speculator, to a land aggregator, and you can become an entrepreneurial rentier to that extent, right? But if you have only 2 acres, and if it is not really going to be in an area which is going to provide you, say, a locational advantage in the form of a differential rent, you typically the Koli Patels are not really, many of them are not in a position to really rentier in a very big way. I mean, of course, if the city comes up, when the city comes up, what you do see in Sri City is that landlords along the internal highways and roads have started creating workers' hostels, right? So petty rentiering of the kind that you see in these regions where they have converted plots of their land into these 4 or 5 story buildings, which are basically rooms for workers. And busloads of workers, migrant workers coming in from Bihar, from Bengal, from other parts of the north coming in and ferried by bus every day that are outside of Sri City, ferried into Sri City and into the special economic zone, which is the customs zone for actually working in the factories, right? And of course, Sri City is one of those cases where actually it's an operational SEZ. So it's a very interesting case in itself. So you do see these kinds of capacities to benefit depending on how much land you have claim to, and that being determined by also the kind of caste that you belong to and who are the big landed caste communities. In Dholera's case, it's the Darbars. The Koli Patels are middle and small landowners. The Dalits are obviously the landless laborers. And so in that sense, the capacity to rentier uh, really varies and is differentiated. And this is something that's documented by several people, including Michael Levian, Thomas Cohen, all of these folks as well.
There's a related question, Preeti. Kirti Dubey says, thank you for such an engaging webinar, ma'am. How can India's urban policies address the unequal distribution of rising land values, especially where caste, inherited property ownership, and capital continue to shape access to urban opportunities?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know really, because as far as urban policy is concerned, if we are going to think about it in a Schumpeterian frame of entrepreneurialism, then there's nothing to be done because growth, like development, is going to trickle down to everybody, right? So eventually, the sort of large landlords will be able to rentier, diversify into some kind of service provisioning, become maybe part of urban villages that are also sort of, spaces of rent. Um, but existing urban policy, I'm not sure, is accounting for any kind of equitable urban development. I don't think that's on the agenda anymore. In fact, equity is something that we don't even hear about anymore. So I think it would require a complete rehaul of the urban policy. The land question and the land redistribution question, that requires a complete sort of rehaul. Maybe it needs to be a kind of a trusteeship. Maybe it needs to be that the discourse on climate change and ecological sort of problems associated with unequal land holdings and ad nauseum sort of construction of built environments. All of this needs to become part of that urban policy. Again, I'm speaking in utopian frames because that is something that needs to be sort of thought of. In some respects, there was a moment where this kind of a more egalitarian bent was coming in through social pressures in the previous sort of regime, with certain kinds of laws that were enacted, whether it is through the employment guarantee law or through the Forest Rights Act. And maybe there was that kind of a policy environment where urban policy also could have moved a little in that kind of a direction. I don't know. There are other urban policy experts. I'm kind of in that uneasy position where I'm neither working in an urban area nor completely working on agrarian issues. So I'm kind of like in that in-between position where agrarian lands are being transformed into urban frontiers. So perhaps others could speak to how urban policy can kind of address these questions of inequality. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Well, urban policy, there are several of my colleagues from CPR, and I'd request them to share thoughts as well. But certainly, the premise that policy takes on is to treat, to not actually, this is my interpretation of infrastructure and growth policies as I've studied them so far in the context of infrastructure governance, that there's, it's neo-Schumpeterians, for instance, are also drawing on scholars from the space of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, where they're actually contesting or rejecting the whole premise of state versus market failure, and they're actually looking at the institutional relationships between states and markets and businesses and state agencies, and where to sort of reinterpret the idea of entrepreneurialism through the lens of uncertainties, profits, and risks. And I think a lot of urban policy or infrastructure policy is also shaped through the large, development finance institutions, which have, so the World Bank, for instance, has program for results, P for R, which builds in a lot of these outcomes, which are all inclusive of social, economic, as well as sustainability agendas. The extent to which the policy reforms actually respond to all these aspects is a different question and needs to be investigated. But I think there's market-driven logics which are bringing in policy reforms through state-led regulation, laws, and policy spheres and schemes, I suppose. That's how I would sort of read the space of policy. But also not neglecting risks is my understanding. But I would really invite other colleagues to share thoughts, because policy is such a wide sphere, and there's one can't homogenize that space. But over to the office at CPR. Rama, would you like to take questions from the office, please?
Take Partha's question. One second. Okay, what happened? Hi, Champaka. Can you hear me? Yes, Partha has asked one question online. I think we should take his question first, and then we'll take the questions
No,
from the
go ahead. Don't worry about that. Take the rest from the audience. We can always have that conversation later. Sure.
Now I invite the attendees in the room to ask their questions. Yes, please. Yes, this is the question.
It's also being recorded. And turn the mic towards you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Preeti, for brilliant presentation. My name is Hitesh. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Antwerp, and I'm doing my research on in Gurugram on social consequences of remote work, and I'm looking at the mobility and the infrastructure of Gurugram as well. So I did come across some of the names that you mentioned, like Thomas Cohen and their work. So my question is, at what point does repeated appropriation through speculative appreciation cease to be just like a parasitic, cease to be merely parasitic upon anticipated accumulation and become an accumulation regime in its own rights? I want to give an example for here for like Xiangan area in it's almost like 100 kilometers from Beijing, and China has been able to make a good speculative town, quote unquote, in that way. Whereas we also see Gurugram as a standing failure almost for what speculative capital does. I also asked this question because you mentioned about the land reforms that failed. So that's the pretext of the question. You give us the genealogy, and you made the case about the failure of land reform. I want to ask that why did that happen? As in, what was the case, or is the caste, or was it its structuring practices, which is the Brahminical cosmology of everyday life in these dominated regions, which are eventually like these are the castes which we just mentioned, for instance, Jats or Patels, or these are like the new dominant castes that have accumulated these land capitals. They're enfolding themselves into the Brahminical cosmologies. Has that affected these failures? So I want to know like more social and cultural factors for that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Should I take that, or should we take some more, or?
Rama, are there more questions?
We will take one or two more questions and then.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, please go ahead.
I can't hear you. It's not audible.
Okay,
I
now
think it's
now
yeah, now it's audible. Yeah.
audible.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, thank you for your presentation. My name is Parivartan. I'm working on property dealers in Sonipat. So, my question is that is around value. So, when you're referring to this future, so what kind of say sociological value that is being invoked in this kind of value regime? Second is that is and this question is also that I am grappling with, is that does the value of land always increase? Does the price of land always increase? And also in the sense that I'm referring to Andrew Huxley's work on Nepal, where he says that the kinship takes the land into it, so that the supply of land does not get into the land market. So we don't get to know that land prices are going down. People just say that, oh, they are not selling it in that way. So in that assumption, and also I understand your point of that sovereign is reinforced by the property rights and vice versa, property rights reinforce the sovereign. In the everyday life of Dholera, how does this trading class or how this rentier class work or come into this ambit of political parties to reinforce this rentier economy at that level? Thank you.
Thank you. Should I answer then? Thank you.
Okay. Preeti, we can take one more question.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am, for the beautiful presentation. I want to ask that, considering the transition of property from since the colonial period till now, and considering also the legacy of right to property, as you have stated, that it is a socialist idea of redistribution of property from the major holders like zamindar to the tenants, has it led to the embourgeoisement of the Indian society? I am asking in terms of the class. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay.
Am I
Thank
audible?
you. Huh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Am I
Vikas, go
audible?
ahead.
Yeah. Ma'am, we have a lot of resources like water resources, and there are misuse of the resources. We face flood, and the effect of that flood, we lost a lot of lives and loss of a lot of GDP. So how can we use those resources to contribute in GDP, like agri-business allied sectors and in fishery? There are a lot of central sector schemes, centrally sponsored schemes, state sponsored schemes. We are not able to implement those schemes. Even in district like Bihar, Gopalganj, and a lot of districts, we are not able to use a lot of funds which are remain unused due to lack of these administrative uh, lacuna. How can we use all those resources in constructive uses?
Okay. Well, thank you. I think I'll just answer the question so far. So, when does speculation become a regime of accumulation? I mean, speculation itself is not a regime of accumulation. It's not producing anything by itself, right? So, I mean, that's why for me, that conceptual clarity is extremely important, where speculation emerges or the kind of claim to rent emerges in the moment of distribution of value. Right now, that distribution of value. So, if you look at Brett Christopher's work on rent and sweating of assets. So, you have all of these brokers going around and creating a kind of story about assets. And like somebody pointed out, not really telling us the truth, or not really telling us what is happening with property values, but creating this kind of an enthusiasm for property values and property speculation. You have these people who are sweating these assets, right? And does that mean you're producing that value? That sweating of assets is also labor. So it can be recognized as labor, but does that make it the production of value? That's like an open debate. I mean, a lot of the financialization literature also talks about how many of these instruments or of financialization, the production of that instruments, is that a kind of a production of value, or is it a kind of speculation on the future source of income and the future sort of performance of labor, right? So this is a big sort of question. How do you actually appropriately classify this form of speculation? So even with the 2008 crisis, the big financial crisis, global financial crisis, you had the forms of speculation where bad loans were given out. Bad loans were given out to risky borrowers, which eventually the bubble burst because of a particular kind of interpretation of that moment, where people started defaulting on the loans that they had taken. They were not able to repay those the interest rates of the loans that they had taken, of the risky loans that they had taken, and that entire speculative bubble came crashing down, right? So the whole foreclosures crisis and all the sort of poor folk who had invested in trying to, become homeowners, right? Basically, could their entire loans just fell apart on their heads because they defaulted on their loan payments, right? So in a sense, the risk is precisely that it is so speculative that at the end of the day, that in itself is not a productive activity. The productive activity is to the extent of building a building. So if you add a floor to your building in anticipation of, future rents coming in, that building in itself is a production of value, right? You're employing labor, you're buying resources, you're creating a kind of a productive asset, which you are then going to use for rentiering from, right? But so in a sense, that act of production exists simultaneously with the anticipation of rentiering. But rentiering itself is a speculative activity, which is not an accumulation, which is why I don't know, I have problems with people who talk about accumulation through speculation. I'm not sure what that means. And that's why I was at pains to distinguish in my paper that what you are acquiring through speculation is appropriation. It's not accumulation, because accumulation occurs in the moment of production and appropriation occurs in the moment of distribution. So you are appropriating as a big landlord or even as a small landlord, where there is a need for renting, for folks who want to rent your property. You are appropriating that income, you're appropriating that sort of value, but it's not really accumulating value. So I think conceptually, I don't think it ever becomes, speculation ever becomes a regime of accumulation. It becomes a regime of speculation or a regime of appropriation, I would argue, and not accumulation. And you can look at a lot of the literature on rent theory, Swingadu and Ruchi. A lot of people have been sort of making these kinds of clarifying discussions of what really is the distinction between the moment of appropriation of this rent and the moment of accumulation. So yeah, I don't think it does become a regime of appropriation, but not really a regime of accumulation, unless it actually leads to a productive asset, investment in a productive asset or in producing an asset, right? And the question of labor being productive when it is sweating assets or when it is trying to create financialized instruments for selling those instruments, which are speculative. Is that productive labor? But at the same time, it is labor. Then if it is not productive labor and it's not leading to accumulation, how is it, I would argue, then a labor of appropriation? And it is labor, but it is actually labor that enhances the appropriation of value rather than accumulation of value. So that would be
Yeah,
my
ma'am, you
answer.
are absolutely right, ma'am.
So,
Ma'am,
thank
in this
you. Thank
current
you.
context, you are right, ma'am. But the state which is facing right now, and we are seeking solution. There are around 537 crore rupees, which goes when, and we are not able to utilize those funds.
Is that Vikas who's speaking?
Yeah.
Okay. Vikas, sorry, I was actually referring to one of the earlier questions. So if you don't mind, I will go one by one. And I mean, if you would like me to address your question first, to tell you honestly how you can make good on resources, whether it is fisheries or land, and how you can actually produce GDP on the land. A lot of people have been talking about encouraging, like if you read Pranab Sen and many other economists, they have been, Professor Nagaraj, many of them have been arguing for the need for policy focus on small and medium enterprises that are sort of situating themselves in domestic production, right, and in local and regional production, and a policy emphasis that actually looks at local needs and not developing fisheries for necessarily global markets, which is linked to all kinds of global circuits, which may or may not exist depending on which region of the country you are in, but to actually encourage the local medium and small sort of economic activities through policy support. So, I mean, I'm not an expert at all on fisheries, but I would imagine if I were to treat land as a resource, that is where a lot of the sort of policy recommendation is going. I had the chance to actually speak to Arvind Subramanian because he came and presented at Krea University recently. And I was talking to him about this MSME kind of focus. And he was of the opinion that Tamil Nadu has done really well as a state in terms of actually creating the kind of industrial synergies. And it's one of the most advanced states in the country. And that we should think about Tamil Nadu as a model of forms of industrialization. Now, I'm not an expert on Tamil Nadu, so I will not be able to say exactly how how they have gone about creating these kinds of productive synergies. But I mean, I can recommend different folks, including Sharad Chari and various other economists who you might want to look at when thinking about resources in general, right? And then fisheries with its own kind of fugitive resource, because fish is something that is a fugitive resource, right? It's alive. It's something that is that has a life of its own. But yeah, so Purendra Prasad is also kind of looking at fisheries and fisheries development in Andhra Pradesh. So maybe you want to also take a look at his work in developing that. But I'm sorry, I'm not really an expert, so I won't be able to address that kind of policy specifically aimed at fisheries. Somebody had asked about value in terms of a sociological value that emerges. And I think the kind of value that you have in mind is also what Sushmita Pati is sort of talking about when she's talking about value, right? Which is a very different framing of value, drawing from Graeber, where value emerges as an anthropological category or a sociological category of meaning making, right? Which is very different from the manner in which I'm approaching value circuits, because for me, it's coming from the labor theory of value, the production of value in the entire economic system through the moments of production, exchange, distribution, consumption, which are all integrated. So it's, in a sense, not even as if it is parasitical. These are all integrated. The contradictions may appear between one sort of moment of either consumption or appropriation or distribution, or a crisis that leads to a crisis of production. But at the same time, these are all integrated moments of the circuits of value. So it's a very different theoretical approach from the kind of Graberian value theory, which is really talking about meaning making. And that meaning making emerges in local practices and local languages, right? So whether it is community controlled sort of discourse, where certain things must not be revealed, or certain people must not be involved, right? In order to keep community control, it's a particular articulation of value, which is a sociological, anthropological value. And that is very contextual, because anthropology is very contextual, right? So anthropologically, it would be something that would emerge differently in different contexts, right? So it might be Kiraya in some places, it might be Jati in some places, it might be something else. So I don't know if I've satisfactorily answered your question, but that's how I understand it, that it's a different genealogy of value, right, as a concept or as theory. The socialist redistribution of land that has failed. I mean, I kind of hinted at this, but it's not really land redistribution. I just want to clarify, is not really socialist, because in that sense, it is still pivoting around private property. Right. So the land reforms that the Indian state undertakes is still pivoting around distributing land to individual owners. So there is a kind of more egalitarianism in that, but it is still pivoting to individual property so that the property owners would maximize profit from that individual property. Right. So it is still a very much capitalist kind of framing of land reforms based on individual property, coming from the English liberal tradition of property ownership. Socialist would be collectivization, like what happened in China, right? Or collectivization in East Europe, or in the former USSR, right? That would be socialist. And the resistance to that, I mean, obviously it emerges. There are various moments in Indian history, right? If you look at Vivek Chibar's work, for instance, when he is sort of discussing what happens with the industrial class, particularly with the Quit India movement, right? And this is the example that immediately comes to mind. But with the Quit India movement and the imprisoning of Nehru and Gandhi and all the Congress leadership, the left faction of the Congress really begins to emerge as very, very sort of strong and politically articulate in the 1940s, right? During the Quit India movement. And Vivek Chibber shows how the Bombay Plan, which is sort of supposed to be this wonderful sort of, expression of socialist solidarity by Indian capital, is actually preempting a kind of a socialization of property, nationalization of property and industry in the post-independent state, because this is the 1940s. There's a huge political ferment going on. What path is the Indian independent state going to take? I mean, that Indian independence is coming is for sure, but what path to development is it going to take? So Vivek Chipper sort of brilliantly explains how there was this kind of a demobilization of the left and the Labour Party and the Labour unions that was taking place, that kind of preemptively put in the Bombay Plan, where capital supposedly acquiesced and agreed to oversight by the state. So this whole sort of thing about what is it called, license Raj, right? So that the whole license Raj was something that the Indian capital voluntarily adopted at that time, because they had a socialist kind of bleeding heart, is something that Vivek Chibber criticizes and shows that it was actually a preemptive move. And this was shown by the immediate sort of demobilization of the labor movement, the kind of quieting down and the breaking of the Congress unions, and the sort of departure of the left unions from the Congress umbrella, and the kind of receding of the idea of nationalization of property or nationalization of industry that was achieved through this bleeding heart sort of representation of socialist Indian capital, which is, I guess, oxymoron, socialist capital. So in that sense, I think something similar also happens with land reforms over here, right? That there is this kind of motivation to try and redistribute private property, but at the same time, the electoral sort of contingencies, the fact that it is the big farmers who are the political sort of bahubalis of their regions, that they are sort of resisting, and the Congress party is trying to keep an umbrella kind of formation together and is giving in to sort of pressures from everywhere, so it doesn't really go the whole hog with the distribution agenda as well. All of these and the kind of I don't know if it's the result of embourgeoisement, as much as also the political kind of contingencies that the Congress party faces by the dominant caste landlords. Which include the non-Brahmins, right? I mean, we are talking about the dominant caste landlords are typically your OBCs and middle peasants, middle caste communities. So, I mean, this is something that requires more work. So I would encourage people asking these questions to actually undertake more work in these directions.
Thank you. Thank you, Preeti. Brahma, should we take some questions from online participants?
Yes, let's do that one round.
Yes, thanks. Several questions online. There's one question, there's several questions from, the same participant as well, but I'll read out some that are sort of can be clustered. Balaji GB says, as you mentioned, the Patels and Thakurs have a conflicting interest and differential concentration of land ownership. Is there any such political process, mobilization, or lobbying have unfolded? That's one question from Balaji GB. And the other question that Balaji raises is, he says, not exactly a question, but I would like to ask for enunciating on the fragmentation of solidarity, which you mentioned in the presentation, and how do you differentiate Schumpeterian rents from the traditional concept of rent or Rentier capitalism? Would you like to take these, Preeti, and come back for more? My colleague Shahana Chattaraj is also here. She will share a question in discussion online here.
Should I ask now?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you so much, Preeti. This was an amazing talk, and I've been following your work for a while. I have one empirical question and a couple of theoretical suggestions or ideas. It's amazing you've been following and working on this site for 15 years, and a lot has changed since then, from the initial promise and aspiration of Dholera being a new. I remember Amitabh Kant coming to talk in Oxford when I was there, saying it was going to be a Singapore of Gujarat, to this even land speculation, land development, and all not happening. And so, what did you find has changed, both materially, but also in terms of how do the people who bought land there, how do the people who invested in even the petty rentier capitalism and all, how have they, and how has that affected, say, the political economy of land as well as state-society relations there? The other question is that I see Dholera. So I remember when he said this, it's Singapore in the desert. Now, there is a reason why Singapore is not in the desert. Another point I remember when people were talking about Dholera was that it's going to be 9 times as big as Shanghai. Now, this to me doesn't sound so much like an economic or even a capitalist project, though I will rethink that a bit in my next question. Then something like a Napida or like those, very like a political or nationalistic project rather than say a Sri city, which you compared it to. And this is where it's different from China. And the other possible explanation, so that's one explanation. Another one is that there's just an overcapacity. So where you don't have the fundamentals and you have so much, so how does speculation or land rents work in that case? When you don't have, when you have so much land and you have so much, and you don't necessarily have a reason to invest. And my final point is like, so I agree with you. There's this, it's kind of confusing to think about accumulation with through speculation, but the main way I would imagine that would happen is through financialization, where it doesn't really matter necessarily if that land is productive or not, as long as enough people want to invest there, and that happens in weird ways. So part of why they are redeveloping this and they're trying to transform and clean up and map land everywhere, and is to make it more financial, susceptible or good for foreign capital or even Indian capital to invest in and speculate and grow and accumulate through that. And have you seen that happening? Because it's been a challenge everywhere else. So yeah, those are my questions. Thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Over to you.
So, I mean, the political economy of land in Dholera, the differential interest between the Koli Patels and the Darbars. Interestingly, I mean, they sort of, when they formed the Bavisgam Samiti, they sort of came together. Although it was always delicate because there were constantly also all kinds of conflicts that were erupting in strategy and the sort of, deciding the course forward and so on and so forth. But they did kind of overcome those differences to come together and challenge the institution of Dholera, the process of institution of Dholera for the first several years. And I think Rakib Akhtar's work is also kind of documenting how those solidarities were already always fragmenting, because the same people who would attend meetings would also then become the land aggregators and developers, and not developers, sorry, land aggregators who were kind of trying to consolidate land and sell it to people who wanted to invest in the land, right? So in a sense, that solidarity was always already fragmenting, and yet at the same time it managed to put up a solid front with the sort of challenge in the courts and the status quo maintained in the courts, where land acquisition or land consolidation did not progress right until the sort of emergency powers that were invoked by the National Highway Authority in 2021, right? So from 2015 to 2021, the land had not really been acquired. However, with the emergency powers being used and the highway the peasants also took the highway authority to court. However, the court upheld the right of the authority to build and to use emergency powers to build the expressway, because the sort of justification was that on paper, the land had already been notified as part of the development plan of the Dholera smart city. And under the town planning law, once a development plan was notified and the development schemes were notified, you could argue over what sections and what regions you could really sort of take the development of the region. I mean, which directions it could go in, but you could not really challenge the law itself, right? So this compounded by the fact that land aggregators were already sort of consolidating land and land parcels, and by anecdotal evidence, a lot of people, including one of the key lawyers that was actually fighting for the farmers or representing the farmers, also would constantly talk about how big political elites and families from Ahmedabad and Gandhinagar had invested. Now, it's very difficult to really sort of aggregate that kind of information unless you're actually going and checking land records. I haven't been able to do that kind of granular work. Plus, it's a very sensitive zone because there's a lot of suspicion. It was a zone of, conflict and resistance and so on and so forth. So by anecdotal evidence, what is reported is that a lot of the land parcels have changed hands. There is an impetus, that there is an expectation that, yes, this is a political project, as Shahana was mentioning, where there is a political backing, and because there is a political backing, something or the other is going to come up, right? And so that also fuels the speculation, that also fuels the anticipation, and if nothing else, that is a way of parking money, right? And it becomes a way of investing money into land as one of your assets. It also becomes a way of making that land legible for financiers, as Shahana was also pointing out. However, in this case, we don't have that kind of international financiers coming in to the picture as of now. Like I said, the 21 square kilometers, and perhaps that's what they're waiting for before they start acquiring now land on a larger scale. The 21, and I remember, like in Ahmedabad, I was meeting all the big developers and interviewing them in between 2015 and a few in 2021, and they were not really interested in Dholera. They said, yeah, sure, I mean, there is a land parcel that we can invest in, but there's not really anything being developed over there, and there is no need to do it. I mean, it's barely like 1.5 hours from Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad is already, the dynamism is in the peripheries of Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad is a growing city, and there's plenty to be done in that region without going into this kind of a greenfield zone where even, investments are not coming in. So in that sense, I don't know, I've kind of like mixed up all the questions and my answer to all the questions. So in that sense, what also happened with the acquisition for the highway is that it kind of broke the resistance completely. So the stalwarts of resistance, as I was also mentioning, were also growing older, like 10, 15 years of being out on the street, putting your own money, trying to sort of like, consolidate the resistance, fragmentation, overcome fragmentation, deal with it, negotiate with it. All of these things, I mean, for anybody I think would be backbreaking work already, right? On top of like actually producing food for the family and cultivating the land and, trying to get your kids into school and all of that. And in that sense, that also kind of fragmented the solidarities further, with the big landlords' kids also wanting, and this I know from at least one of my informants really intimately, that with the children also wanting white collar jobs, training to become, workers in the cities rather than actually being cultivators. And in that sense, that kind of solidarity also broke, and the differential interests also emerged through that. And the intergenerational interests also emerged through that, with also the smallholders' children not wanting the land for cultivation anymore, but as a result of the speculation. I mean, this is the first time that I went, and across the villages, I went to about 6. So across the villages, the discussion was land value. It was not agriculture, right? Before this, when I went in 2021, the highway authorities had just dug through the fields, and people were ruining the fact that their agricultural fields have been cut up and dug up, and they were going to go to court, and they were mobilizing, and there were dharnas. People were sitting in front of JCB machines, refusing to let their land being dug up. But in 5 years, the expressway has come up, and the land has been blocked off and looks fairly impressive. So I think like the aesthetics of it are also at play over here at some level, where people are sort of not thinking about resistance in quite that way. And speculation is what has become the biggest business in town, land speculation. Partha has also actually asked a question
Yes.
which is related. So, Champaka, maybe
I
you want
could
to
read
just
it out. Partho's
Yeah.
question is interesting and very relevant. Says, hi Preeti, you mentioned that the exchange value of land has gone up exponentially in Tholera and possibly Goa too. In the absence of realized growth, would you like to speculate on why this is happening? What is the underlying speculation in your field studies? In China too, there are a number of unrealized projects, but there we don't see this increase in land value.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that is precisely what I've been trying to unpack, because, like I said, this is the first time that I went and land value was the only thing. And I think the material evidence of the expressway, the fact that the expressway came to be, and of course, you also have to like imagine this expressway as sort of digging up the fields and using the earth from the same fields for creating this impressive like 6-lane expressway with all the arterial roads coming in and out and going into villages and creating further islands into the region through the building of this. And I think some folks have called this expressway urbanism, or somewhere I remember reading about, this highway urbanism or highway speculation. So this material evidence and the kind of intergenerational sort of reluctance to really think about agriculture as a viable profession, I think has also led to the fueling of land speculation. So my sense is that right now it's kind of anticipating that something or the other is going to come. The fact that 5 industries have come in, there is a big solar plant, a solar energy plant, and there's a lithium ion factory, and there are 2, 3 other kind of industries that have come in. So it seems that it will slowly emerge. People are not necessarily seeing that in 17 years from 2009 to 2026. Only 5 or 6 factories and 1 expressway have come up. People are actually seeing that change, and now they're buying into that kind of speculative spiral. What happens, I suppose we'll have to wait another 5 to 10 years to really see where that leads. But I imagine that they bought into this kind of speculative spiral. Perhaps in China, there is some kind of control on land values. I have no idea. Actually, if you know, it'll be great if you could share why there isn't that kind of land speculation, which is why, I mean, I kind of like tend to think of it as this rentier economy because it is running on empty without actual production processes in place and the destruction of existing production processes. So yeah, that's what I'm not sure if I answered all of Shahana's questions, but I think Shahana, you put your hand up again.
Well, just one question about this. The speculators, are they local or is this some of this Indian diaspora money or national? Who's doing all the buying and selling? And I guess there is an interest in promoting all the people who had invested earlier. So they would want to encourage the speculation. So I guess, is there some mechanism through which they can do that, which maybe doesn't happen in China because, well, there the local state owns the land still. But are the developers somehow able to somehow get these land markets working so that they can keep raising prices?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the sort of landscape of speculation is concerned, it's not very stable. And like I said, every time that I've gone, I've seen a different set of hoardings of the developers, right? And in that sense, it seems to be more local, regional, sort of state level investors that are parking money into land, as opposed to a kind of more consolidated. I mean, I do get and I think a lot of people, in fact, some of my colleagues in Delhi have now been increasingly getting advertisements, invest in Dholera, right? And that may have something to do with also this being a political project and a pet project of the previous chief minister of Gujarat, who's currently the prime minister, right? I mean, he would want to see a certain kind of evolution in the project taking place. So that kind of a political backing for materializing some form of investments coming in almost magically in some way through that kind of political, I don't know, building up of some momentum. So it's not some kind of a consolidated kind of aggregator or financier that's come in, at least to the best of my knowledge till the present. But however, I mean, I think for that to take also, that legibility has to go maybe an extra mile than just that there is this project and it has a highway and 5 industries, perhaps. Yeah. I mean, that's what I can say at this point.
There's one question from Saurav Bhattacharya, which goes back to the earlier question and your response to an earlier question. Perhaps you already responded quite substantially to this, but I'd request you to please think about expanding on it. It says, when infrastructural failure leads to abandonment and urban vacancy, what happens to capital, rent, and value? That's a question which sort of goes back to your thoughts previously on, how the further spiraling of
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, of course, this has been seen as a kind of devaluation of infrastructure, right? So a kind of abandonment because it never got realized. What you also see is ghost towns, right? I mean, there was a lot of stories coming out about the Chinese ghost towns. Or abandoned infrastructures, even abandoned industrial towns in the US, right? Detroit and like some of these cities that were industrial townships, and then capital left, and there was capital flight, and there was this abandonment of infrastructure, which is then infrastructure that has been invested and can never realize its value, and it only keeps getting devalued further and further. So in a sense, it just goes into the ruins of capital. And there is some discussion on capitalist ruins. Anna Singh's work, I think I've forgotten his name. There's somebody else who also talks about ruins. Anyway, so there is this kind of theorization or conceptualization of these ruins and devalued infrastructures that are basically just value that is parked and decaying. So that's what happens, I suppose. It just what happens to the lives of those folks who have betted on that. Eventually, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm saying. We need to. I could speculate that if nothing really comes in the next 5 or 10 years, people will start cultivating whatever little parcels they have left. I mean, which they are continuing to do where they can, where the sort of land is a little further away from the highways and the arterial roads. People are continuing to cultivate that land, right? Because as of now, the land has not been consolidated. But I imagine that land consolidation will only take place contingent upon further investments. Until they are able to secure further investments, they will not be able to consolidate further land because the cost of compensation itself might not be met. I mean, if you were asking me to speculate, this is my speculation of what might happen if things literally don't come to fruition.
Yes, absolutely. If I could make a quick addition to your insights, Preeti, we were discussing earlier as well that, when we have incomplete projects as non-performing assets, then it is often the mid-sized firms that go insolvent or bankrupt. And it's not just firms going bankrupt, but it's because they got onto the value chain through social networks and support from the social networks. But when projects are in duress, then it's the promoters who can already anticipate risks which are coming, and they can anticipate risks to come, and they actually siphon out their capital into other lucrative investments, whereas it's these mid-sized firms that go bankrupt, insolvent, their daughters don't get married, they commit suicides, their insolvencies are not really sorted out in the asset reconstruction company, etc. So there's social implications to these to the question around what happens when these projects don't fructify. Yeah. Thank you for your insights on that. I'll take some more questions. There are lots more questions, actually. Shamal Thakkar says, does the government, state or center, do a deep dive with field experts before going ahead with projects like SEZ, smart cities? Your comments on this, please. Then there's another question from Kalol Kashyap, who says, Professor, would you have any comments on the rising resource politics and land conflicts in the Northeast? Do you see any parallels with your work in Maharashtra and Gujarat? 2 questions and then more?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I mean, see, the whole point of these, what I call growth infrastructures, was to kind of enthuse investment into these models, right? And I don't think there was any kind of a deep dive into the readiness or preparation. Time and again, people have said, and this is when I was doing my work on the making of the Special Economic Zones law, I interviewed bureaucrats, I interviewed also members who were part of the sort of approval process of special economic zones. And off the record, they would also agree that in a meeting of 2 hours, they would at a time approve 25 projects, right? Without any kind of real serious consideration. And they're sitting in Delhi to approve SEZs. So without any real consideration of on-ground realities, or at least not detailed consideration, because the whole idea was that this would be vetted. If the capital, if the developer is interested, then it's, basically also political patronage, then we need to sort of like facilitate capital. This would be a single window clearance kind of mechanism. So you literally had no real on-ground practice of vetting what kind of project was coming. And this was the abandonment of the so-called license Raj as well, right? Of course, the license Raj worked very much to the benefit of large capital in India. And there's a lot of like discussion of the license Raj was only literally for small entrepreneurs an impediment, but it was certainly not an impediment for big capital in India. But in any case, that apart, there was not really any kind of vetting of what exists on ground. Typically, these kinds of decisions are taken in closed rooms without people actually even knowing what's going on in those regions where the projects are being proposed. With Dholera, of course, it's a different reality because it's the state that is actually coming forward with the idea of this project in order to make Singapore in the desert. But it's a lot of political rhetoric. Parallels with the Northeast, actually, I want to read a little more about what's happening because there are all of these infrastructure projects that are being inaugurated. I also want to understand what it means in terms of 6 schedule areas. What does it mean in terms of rentiering? What does it mean in terms of actual investments coming in? So, Kalol, more power to you. And I hope that you're going to be doing your dissertation on these projects and come and talk to me when you do that and tell me a little more. So I'm sorry, I really don't know exactly how the parallels materialize, but I look forward to reading more in the future as folks write about it.
There's a participant who's again exploring the possibility of pursuing a PhD with you. Kiran DM says, Preeti, thank you for the insightful presentation, and it has encouraged me to explore the possibility of pursuing a PhD around the theme Amravati, accumulation, acquisition, and anthropology. I was wondering if you think there could be scope to develop this into a meaningful doctoral research project under your guidance, perhaps by exploring Amravati through the intersections of land capital displacement, social transformation, and anthropology.
No, perfect. Of course, by all means, there are possibilities, but the admissions process is a departmental process. So obviously, all proposals are welcome and PhD admissions follow their regular norms and processes. So by all means, please apply. And not just with me, there are lots of other folks as well that you could try and sort of work with as well.
Parthu, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, no, just a couple of things. Sorry about that. To the Amravati scholar, as just a couple of months ago, we had Carol Upadhyay present a book on Amravati. It's open access. You might want to download and see what she has done. There is also a scholar at Texas A&M called Anand Datla, who is working on Amravati right now. So I'd encourage you to sort of engage with them before you start formulating your thesis around Amravati. But Preeti, on the process of the SEZ approvals, one of the interesting things, and since we're doing this India-China thing a little bit, actually, if you look at the minutes of these meetings, there is the states are supposed to put forward a substantially well-developed proposal, which is then taken sort of consideration of by the Board of Approvals in Delhi at the center. And then, and you're right, that a number of these places look very perfunctory because a lot of these, of course, as you well know, were ITSEZs, which are these, a small 10-acre parks in the middle of nowhere sometimes. But most of the due diligence, in some sense, is supposed to be done at the level of the state. And in China, the local governments and the provincial governments also do a lot of that, and I think they do that a lot more. Here, and this is an issue which perhaps could benefit from further research, is the extent to which the state actually sees this as the kind of jobs growth kind of stuff that you're talking about, and where the state actually, or sometimes the state sees these as more performative things, where the idea is to basically say, oh, we have 100 SEZs in our state, without really sort of following through on actually the growth and the employment benefits of that particular structure. So I'm just curious about when your conversations on the SEZ and also in the conversations in Goa and in Dholera, and I'd be really interested to understand how whether or not you have any difference. Are there any fundamental differences that you find between Goa and Dholera in the way you sort of analyze this notion of speculative processes? Or are these, the way you presented it, is it roughly, did the framework that you present sort of apply both to Dholera and Goa? And Goa being, from what I understand, more the sort of old-fashioned small SEZ kind of project.
Yeah, no, thank you, Partho. I mean, of course, Goa is also a very interesting case, and I'm glad you brought up Goa because I didn't get a chance to at all talk about it. But is also an interesting case because of precisely the due diligence which was not done, right? And perhaps I've extrapolated too quickly from that experience, but the fact that SEZs were approved without adequate documentation. And I think in your book as well, Solano's paper was also talking about these things. The fact that approvals were given like literally overnight, and even before the SEZ, the state's SEZ policy was notified, approvals had been taken, right? And so in a sense, I guess it would be uneven depending on which region we are talking about. Goa is, of course, a very distinctive kind of space with already well-developed sort of urbanized land markets, precisely because of its purchase as this kind of tourist destination, a lot of interest in metropolitan meaning from residents from Delhi, Mumbai, and elsewhere wanting to invest in vacation homes in Goa and second homes and so on and so forth, and a thriving tourist economy. And all of that has already created a very, very sort of highly developed land market, which is very different. So when I actually went to Dholera in 2015, was actually when I first went, so about 11 years. When I went to Dholera, I expected that it would be something similar because it's in proximity to Ahmedabad, and there would be real estate actors who would be invested in trying to sort of acquire land banks and make sure that they make good on it. And it was a complete sort of opposite experience because nobody was interested in Dholera. And in that sense, they're completely different, and yet the same phenomena of speculation based on the creation of some kinds of infrastructures, urban infrastructures, the attraction of sort of the anticipation of attracting productive capital, despite them being much smaller given the size of Goa. All of that holds true, but the land markets were already far more well developed. The real estate actors were very much interested in making sure that they got a piece of the pie in Goa, which was unlike in Dholera. So, but what you do, I mean, in that sense, my argument regarding not being able to create that kind of productive employment or that kind of productive investment, and instead creating this kind of rentiering infrastructure or basically infrastructure for furthering speculative sort of price rises of land and property is what is kind of similar in the two cases. Of course, the entire genealogy of historical genealogy, which is the other reason why I couldn't bring Goa into the picture today, is very different from the British genealogy because Goa comes from the Portuguese sort of codification of comunidades or jointly held land by the Gaonkaris, who were these upper caste elites who actually controlled the land in all the villages. And so the Gaonkaris were codified as comunidades by the Portuguese, under the Portuguese. And there's all kinds of debates, but of course, I mean, there are a lot of like romantic representations of how the Gaonkari was completely egalitarian and, everybody had access to land and all of that. But some historical record also points to the fact, and also the contemporary sort of land holdings also point to the fact that it has always been the Brahmin elites and the upper caste elites who have held land also in the comunidades, although there is a kind of a shared system through which now also Adivasi folks have become holders of comunidad property through various kinds of, rejigging of land parcels and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, they're very distinct in terms of the development of the land market and the impetus for acquiring land. It is for sure that if the SEZs had been retained, then the real estate actors were certainly very much interested in developing real estate enclaves, urban enclaves in Goa. And while the SEZ resistance was successful over there and the state was compelled to sort of cancel SEZs with work underway. And that was subsequently, of course, challenged in the court by the developers. Interestingly, the High Court of Goa, the Mumbai High Court Goa bench basically upheld the state's prerogative to cancel the SEZ policy. And then eventually they took the developers took the case to the Supreme Court, and the Goa government recently, I think a few years ago, made an out-of-court settlement for the expenses that they had already invested into the land. However, I mean, the change sort of nature of speculation in Goa is also emerging through this kind of coal corridor that is emerging in Goa, where Goa has become this transit point for coal supplies to be brought in and also to be exported, coming in from the expansion of the Mormugao Port Trust into this kind of more privatized port berths, where highways are now connecting the ports directly into Karnataka for transportation of coal and other kind of resources out of Karnataka. So there's a whole lot of mobilization around that coal corridor and acquisition of land that is taking place as this kind of bypass urbanism. Where Goa itself is bypassed through these highways and it becomes kind of a corridor for connecting more interior regions. What else can I think of as far as Goa is concerned? I mean, there's a lot of course, tourism development related rentiering. There's a whole lot of agitation right now going on with the town and country planning law, bringing in these controversial clauses where people can convert green zones into residential and construction zones by basically just sort of expressing the desire to do so. So there's this controversy, there's this enough is enough movement where retired Justice Rebello has sort of really mobilized a lot of Goans across the state against this provision of Section 39 A or 39B, I forget at the moment, where changes in the town planning law have allowed people to ask for changes in order to create real estate projects in the green zone areas much more freely. So the distinctive difference is definitely the much more developed land markets and a desire for real estate in Goa.
Thank you so much. Those were really important insights. There are 8 more questions that are pending, and let me cluster them in 3 parts to sort of expedite. It's already 6:15, and there's these are intense discussions. There's Priyadarshini who says, I would like to hear your thoughts on recent cancellation of the Greenfield Airport project in Chennai. How should we understand this in relation to appropriation of land value and speculation? Because a lot of real estate development has already happened in anticipation of the airport and other infrastructure developments, but the project has been dropped now. Speaks to your earlier response as well in some ways, but over to you on that. There's a question from Manvita Baradi, says, sorry, joined late, but can you talk about the Disturbed Areas Act, which is detrimental in many aspects, but specifically for equitable urban development? Then there's Rahul Basu, who says, how does this connect with Henry George's argument that rent is socially created and should be recovered through appropriate taxes, example, land value taxes? Would you like to take those? They're not directly all speaking to one another, because most of these questions are not really possible to cluster.
No, I would actually like to hear more about the cancellation of this Greenfield Airport project and what led to it. Was there resistance, or what has actually gone around? Because that would actually help us place it in other dynamics of what's happening around Chennai. I mean, of course, the East Coast region is completely taken over by real estate and urban sort of development, and it's an agglomerating kind of corridor all the way down to Pondicherry and perhaps even further. At least I've been till Pondicherry. So I'm not sure about the details of this project. I would love to hear more and talk about it. So feel free to send me any details. The Disturbed Areas Act, I'm sorry, that's not really within the purview of my work, so I'm going to let that go. Land value taxes, I mean, sure, that would be an interesting way of making good on speculative gains. And that could be one way in which policy could try and address these kinds of really sort of large speculative gains that some actors seem to appropriate. I'd have to think a little more about what it means in terms of the larger dynamic of accumulation, inadequate accumulation and ongoing speculation. But I think any kind of progressive taxation at this point, which thinks about how to redistribute some surpluses and gains, would be really helpful in thinking through policy for more egalitarian purposes.
2 questions on caste politicians. Vinay Damodar says, thank you for a nice presentation. Is there any role of dominant caste politicians in this land settlements, like Marathas dominate Maharashtra politics and also own large sections of lands? Yeah, I think that's one question. And there's, well, that's it. I think they've repeated this question actually, so that takes care of it. There's Aman Roy who says, thank you for such an engaging and thorough journey through the land question in India. My question is regarding the forms taken by forms of local governance or collective organization. Can you speak more about how you have seen peasant associations, activist organizations, or panchayats articulate antagonisms or kinds of critical distance towards land markets built through the logic of speculation? So yes, these 2 questions, one on caste politicians and the other on collective organization.
Are there any more, or are these the last ones?
No, there are a few more. Judith Shruti says, can you speak a bit about your thoughts on how this intersects with the rights of nature? Then, so that's one. Yes, that's all actually we've responded to. If you respond to these, then we have responded to all questions.
Okay, so this region is very interesting because it's not the region of the dominant Patel Patidar formation, right? In terms of Dholera, where you have this kind of dominant caste politics that also is politically sort of very well aligned, right? The Koli Patels are a particular class of, I mean, they call themselves Patels, but they are a particular class of small to middle peasant owners who are not necessarily politically very powerful, right? The Darbars are a minority, and the Darbars are really the old sort of ruling classes who still have large land parcels. But they're not like the kind of dominant caste formation like the Marathas that influence all kinds of political decision making. So that is my understanding of the region in terms of caste dynamics. I think where resistance has been successful, like in Mandal Pocharaji, it has depended purely on electoral contingencies. And this is something that I've been saying all the way back in 2015, that it's always electoral contingency that works with this particular set of political leaders, Modi and the BJP under this configuration, where which also explains what happens with the farmers' bill, and the fact that the agitation continued without any kind of closure for 2 to 3 years, and then eventually, I think they decided that this is going to have some kind of electoral repercussion, and hence conceded to demands of the farmers. The same thing happens with the Cockroach Janata Party and what have you. So my sense is that in this political configuration, what really works is a sense of electoral contingency and where it might come to bite them. At least I've seen that work repeatedly. Collective organization, I mean, certainly in Goa, where real estate was a big sort of articulation against real estate, particularly because real estate actors were seen as these metropolitan outsiders who were coming into Goa. And Goa has this kind of, exceptionalism of Goa for Goans. We come from a distinct lineage of, not being under British rule, being a Portuguese sort of colony, and a particular cultural ethos, and I mean, all those questions about how Goa became part of India and its accession into India, and all of those questions also create this dynamic of Goans versus non-Goans. And as a result, because of the metropolitan sort of developers and investors coming in, because of the sort of booming land market in Goa, which continues to boom, you did have a very clear articulation of not wanting these metropolitan developers who were making property also unaffordable for the local Goan by sort of aligning with markets outside of Goa. So typically, these elite development projects are catered towards these elite vacation and second home kind of investments. So that form of collective organization was certainly present in Goa. Here in Dholera, like I said, I mean, it was not really about real estate because there wasn't that kind of a on-ground situation where real estate developers were swooping in, but it was certainly about protecting agriculture and their agricultural sort of activities when the resistance was there. Now it is about land value, and there isn't that kind of resistance. There is that we need to get better compensation than the 2011 rates, which were sort of promised at the time that the project was announced. Rights of nature, I mean, that is what I was kind of like going toward when I was talking about land as a kind of a thinking about land as a relational category and not as property and alone or not reduced to property, not reduced to a kind of an anthropocentric utilitarianism, but also thinking about land as a fundamental affordance for life. And that requires that articulation of land as a fundamental affordance of life. I think at this point, the planetary limits framework really points to land as that important. I mean, they have all kinds of things like ocean acidification, ozone layer depletion, so on and so forth, the greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. But land use change being recognized also in the planetary limits framework and the transgression of planetary boundaries, I think comes closest to articulating the rights of nature, or comes closer to articulating the rights of nature as land. But of course, that doesn't really exist in India. We are sort of like, or it exists in very limited ways. I think one of my colleagues, Abhairaj Nayak, talks about that framework a little more, and maybe I'll have a chat with him and figure out a little more in detail how that might apply. But yeah, that's what I have at this point.
Thank you, Preeti. Over to the office, Rama and Pushpaji. Questions from y'all, and then we will close the session.
We don't have any. Okay, we don't have any questions in the room, so I think it's time to close. Yeah. Thank you so much, Preeti, for your talk. Like it began with philosophy, then history, and then political science, and then lastly we come to the story of sociology, and and the very question of the land, which has become very central to this very story of our development and growth of this post-liberal India, and so many of inequalities are built around this. So that way your talk was very, very interesting, interdisciplinary. But I think you have given very elaborate answers to all our questions, and very patiently so. So with that, I want to thank you so much, and thanks to my colleagues, thanks to Champaka. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for organizing this, and also all the participants for all your wonderful questions. Thank you. Really
Thank you,
enjoyed.
Preeti. Really huge thanks from all of us. What an amazing session this was. Very nuanced assertions from you, theoretical assertions, and we'd really love to engage further with your work, and will remain in contact as well. Thank you so very much once again.
Thank you.
And many thanks to the audiences who've stayed back till so late in the evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.